Hello Indian Creek 8th grade students, this is Mr. Roush, bringing you the third video in our Reconstruction series, The South During Reconstruction. In our first video, we focused on the different Reconstruction plans, such as Lincoln's 10% plan, the Radical Republican plan, and then Johnson's Presidential Reconstruction. Then in video 2, we talked about the Radicals in control, which were the Radical Republicans, and this video is going to focus on the South during Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the Republican Party came to dominate Southern politics. The support for the Republican Party came mainly from three groups. We had African Americans, who a majority of them were Republican. We had the white Southerners who supported the Republican policies. And then we had the white settlers who came from the North down to the South to help them out and to aid them in rebuilding their government. African Americans played an important role in Reconstruction politics both as voters and as elected officials. In states where African American voters were the majority, they contributed heavily to Republican victories. African Americans did not control the government of any state, although they briefly held a majority in the lower house of South Carolina legislature. In other southern states, they held important positions, but never in proportionate to their numbers. At the national level, there were 16 African Americans in the House of Representatives and 2 in the Senate between 1869 and 1880. The first African American government was Hiram Revels, who was a senator from Mississippi. He was the first African American senator to take office on February 25, 1870. Hiram Revels wasn't just a senator, he was also an ordained minister, and during the Civil War, he had recruited several African Americans for the Union Army. He also started a school for freed African Americans in St. Louis, Missouri, and served as chaplain of an African American regiment in Mississippi. Revels maintained in Mississippi after the war and was elected to the Senate in 1870. He only served a year in the Senate, where he declared he received fair treatment. Another famous African American senator was Blanche K. Bruce, who also came from Mississippi. He was a former runaway slave. He had established a school for African Americans in Missouri when the war began. In 1869, he went to Mississippi and entered politics and became superintendent of schools, kind of like how Mr. Willis is the superintendent of Indian Creek School District. He served on the Senate from 1870 until 1880, serving for 6 years. Some Southern whites supported Republican policy throughout Reconstruction. Many were non-slaveholding farmers or business leaders who had opposed secession in the first place. Many of the former Confederates despised them for siding with the Republicans and called them scalawags, which is a term meaning scoundrel or worthless rascal. Many of the Confederates in the South believed that they betrayed them because they were supporting the ideas of the Republicans in the North. Many Northern whites who moved to the South after the war also supported the Republicans, and they served as Republican leaders during Reconstruction. Critics called these Northerners carpetbaggers because they arrived with all their belongings in cheap suitcases made of carpet fabric. So some of these were reformers from the North, such as doctors, lawyers, and teachers who wanted to help reform Southern society. Although some of the carpetbaggers were greedy and took advantage of the situation in the South, most did not. Many carpetbaggers were former Union Army soldiers or members of the Freedmen's Bureau who liked the South and wanted to settle there. The carpetbaggers were not well liked by the people in the South. Many Southerners ridiculed the Reconstruction governments and accused them of corruption, or dishonest or illegal actions, and financial mismanagement. While some officials made money illegally, the practice was hardly widespread. Indeed, there was probably less corruption in the South than there was in the North. Most white Southerners opposed efforts to expand African Americans' rights. Plantation owners tried to maintain control over freed people in any way they could. Many told African Americans they could not leave the plantations. Most white landowners refused to rent land to freedmen. Other white Southerners also made life difficult for African Americans. The store owners refused them credit, and employers refused to give them work. Some whites also used fear and force to keep freedmen in line. The fear that they used was the Ku Klux Klan. Violence against African Americans and other white supporters became commonplace during Reconstruction. Much of the violence was committed by secret societies organized to prevent freedmen and women from exercising their rights and help whites regain power. The most terrifying of the societies was the Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1866, and they wore white sheets and hoods, and members of the Klan launched midnight raids against African Americans where they would burn their homes, churches, and schools. They didn't just burn the homes and schools, but they also killed as well. In Jackson County, Florida, the Klan murdered more than 150 people over a 3-year period. Klan violence also often increased right before elections, as the group tried to scare African Americans to keep them from voting. The Klan also attacked white supporters of the Reconstruction. Southerners opposed to terrorism appealed to the federal government to do something. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed several laws to try and stop the growing violence of the Klan. These laws had limited success. Most of the white Southerners refused to testify against those who attacked African Americans and their white supporters. Still, enough arrests were made to restore order for the 1872 presidential election. You can make the connection with the gangs in Chicago, how most of the people in the neighborhood refused to testify against the person who was shooting or the gang violence, because they're afraid that if they testified, then the gang would come after them. Just like back in the 1800s, if a family testified against the Klan would come and attack their family. Despite some violence, Reconstruction brought important changes throughout the South. This was especially true in education. Education improved for both African Americans and the whites. African Americans saw education as an important step to a better life. In many regions, they created their own schools, contributing both labor and money to build the schools. The Freedmen's Bureau and private charities played a major role in spreading education. Northern women and free African Americans came south to teach in these schools. By 1870, there was about 4,000 schools had been established, and with about 200,000 students. More than half of the teachers in these schools were African American. In the 1870s, Reconstruction governments began creating public school systems for both races, which had not existed in the South before the war. Within a few years, more than 50% of the white children and about 40% of the African American children in the South were enrolled in public schools. Northern missionary societies also established academies offering advanced education for African Americans. Some academies developed into colleges and universities, such as Morehouse College and Atlanta University. Generally, African Americans and white students attended different schools. Only Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida required the schools be integrated, which includes both whites and African Americans. But the laws were not always enforced. Along with education, most freed people wanted land. Some African Americans were able to buy land with the assistance of the Freedmen's Bank, established in 1865, but most, however, failed to get their own land. So the former slave owners had all this land, but they had nobody to tend to the land. So that's where sharecropping would come in. So the most common form of farm work for freed individuals was sharecropping. In this system, a landowner rented a plot of land to a sharecropper or farmer, along with a crude shack, some seeds, and tools, and if they were lucky, they would get a mule. In return, the sharecroppers shared a percentage of their crop with the landowner. After paying the landowners, sharecroppers often had little to sell. Sometimes there was barely enough to feed their families. For many, sharecropping was just a little bit better than slavery. We'll go a little further into sharecropping with an activity we're going to do tomorrow. Well, that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.